I want you to take a look at the Dung Defender from Hollow Knight. He's a pretty fun boss. I am a fellow defender of fecal matter myself, but you know what would make him even better? If he was enormous. Video game bosses come in a wide variety of sizes. Some are my height, some are about average, which in Dark Souls are the most dangerous, and some are much larger than your character. However, on rare occasions, you get a boss that towers over all who stand before it. Giant boss fights are a spectacle to behold. We need those bosses that make you wonder, how am I supposed to fight that? It's great to see how different games approach fighting colossal encounters, whether it's climbing them, poking their appendages, or growing to their size, for an all-out brawl of epic proportions. It really depends on the game and what mechanics surround the gameplay that determines how these giants function. And that's why I'm here today, to not only explain why these boss fights are so grand, but to see how each game I'll talk about today tackles their own selection of giants, and why it works so well. So, without further ado, my name is Josh, also known as Curious George, and I hope you enjoy. First, let's talk about the two issues giant bosses have, based on my experience. Number one is the camera. Sometimes games don't factor in that, maybe you would like to see the boss you're fighting, or at least not have an all-out brawl with the camera. I am sick and tired of looking at feet all the time. I'm looking at you, Dark Souls 2, the Giant Lord. And listen, you might be thinking, Josh, it's an older game, give it a break. No, I don't think so. 2D games are excellent at handling giant bosses. It's so easy to incorporate the boss's sheer mass without risking the camera because it's a fixed angle. There are many ways to express the boss's design in a clear fashion due to the nature of 2D games. So 3D games, make sure your camera angles are good. I'd rather not question if I'm staring at a kneecap or a ball sack. Number two is simply, they're boring. But giant bosses have a specific way of being boring. This happens when a game doesn't know what to do with a giant boss, so they pick one of three choices. Quick time events, long distance shooting, or they have a gimmicky nature to it, like Yorm from Dark Souls 3. What all three of these have in common, mostly, is that victory is reliant on being submissive. You have to wait for the giant to move first in order to deal any damage, whether they enter a stun state or expose a limb, for example. It's rather tedious and makes for a very dull encounter. Now, those three choices by themselves are a problem, but if you have a mixture of those three with some gameplay in between, it's not that bad. For now, let's talk about Shadow of the Colossus. Shadow of the Colossus is a game that specializes in giant boss fights. The concept here is every Colossus is a puzzle. You have to figure out how to effectively scale their figure to reach their weak spots. What Shadow of the Colossus emphasizes is the grand spectacle of a giant boss fight. And listen, look, some bosses are performance in their own right. I love Lady Maria from Bloodborne. The whole flames and blood dance is freaking awesome, and I respect that. But you can't beat those bosses that make you feel so insignificant. You are but a speck to these colossi, but it has a health bar, so there's a way to kill it. When you play this game, you really feel the absolute size of these creatures as they tread the landscape, shaking the ground, or soaring through the skies. Every single one, okay, well almost, is breathtaking. One of my favorites being Avion the Fifth Colossus. Avion is a giant bird the size of a house that resides in a large lake. Now what you have to do is make the bird angry by shooting it with arrows. This will trigger Avion to swoop down towards the wanderer, allowing for one of the best moments in the game. A unique factor about Shadow of the Colossus is it does a great job at being cinematic without relying on cutscenes alone. All of what you witnessed was pure gameplay, and gameplay-wise, this game is great 75% of the time. I'm not gonna lie to you, it can be a bit janky, but the methodical approach to these colossi is what I love about this game. I appreciate how slow the colossi move. This is key because it allows us to fully absorb the majesty of these creatures. Not to mention that their full bodies are in view. Like, many giant boss fights don't ever show the full figure. I'm thinking about the Icon of Sin from Doom Eternal. That's a great boss fight, by the way. I don't have no problems with it, but you really don't understand how small you are because all you see is the torso and above. Combine that with a minimalistic landscape, and that makes the Colossus the center of attention 100% of the time. It is vital that giant bosses are your main focus without many distractions, and Shadow of the Colossus does this best. There is no other game that can come close to respecting their giant creatures and the spectacle of it all. The only thing that's missing is the in-game comparison, not only to other bosses that are much smaller, but from a gameplay perspective. I mean, that's why large bosses that only appear once or twice in other games, such as the Divine Dragon from Sekiro, are highlighted throughout most people's playthroughs because they change up the formula. Normally, you're clashing swords on the beat with demons, spirits, and your dad. The Divine Dragon is very different. Check this out. It's a complete change of pace that doesn't present much difficulty, but it's a lot of fun. Let's keep this train going and talk about other giant bosses that impact their respective games. Monster Hunter is a great series that revolves around hunting monsters with the skin of other monsters. All of these creatures vary in size, from relatively big to super chunky, but none can light a candle to Jhen Mohran from Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate. Is that how that saying goes? Wait a minute. Oh, it's hold a candle. I said light a candle, my bad. Actually, there are some monsters that do light candles. Cedius, Dalamadur, but none of them require a heavily equipped boat to take down, now do they? Jhen Mohran surfs through an ocean of sand, the Great Desert it's called, and as an Egyptian, I'm already in love. So you must surf alongside this elder dragon, wearing it down before the final showdown. Your artillery consists of ballistas, cannons, a gong, and the Dragonator, a giant metal spear to prevent certain assaults. After enough damage has been done, Jhen Mohran will go perpendicular, allowing players to jump onto his tusks to deal direct damage to the body. This is one of the most common tropes giant bosses have, scaling their figure. We've already established that with Shadow of the Colossus, but Monster Hunter has different mechanics and pacing, so the approach is not the same. Instead, you don't get stuck on the butt crack for 5 minutes, and mounting Jhen Mohran is only half the fight. Although this is where most of the damage can occur, especially if you're a seasoned veteran like myself. Ha! Balancing between firing heavy artillery and smacking the weak spots on his spine has a great dynamic. To top it off, there's the final showdown, a glorious last stand where... Okay, well, he's not here yet. Just give him some time. He'll make his way here. Yeah, this is not the best part of the fight. What I'm trying to say here is that Jhen Mohran changes up the formula of typical gameplay in Monster Hunter by adding in a large boat. Why? Because he's big. That's it. Bayonetta 3 has multiple bosses of unbelievable size that represents the downright ridiculous nature of this series. Unfortunately, most of the time these giant bosses are stripped down to being a mini-game or a very simplistic version of your typical combat. Bayo 3's combat is crazy good. You don't want to give that up for anything, unless the spectacle makes up for it, which in most cases, it really doesn't. The Divine Dragon doesn't have your usual top-tier combat of Sekiro, but the presentation is off the charts when compared to the others, and it's still a lot of fun. With Bayonetta 3, the whole game is a performance in its own right. So giant bosses are not going to typically stand out as much as they do in other games because your usual 30 seconds of gameplay includes summoning large demons, perfect dodges for slowing down time, fast-paced combos. It's this exhilarating rush from beginning to the end. I mean, the music's good, but when I'm moving at the pace of a turtle, it kinda loses all enjoyment. Hey, you know what? Giant bosses are not always a good thing. Sometimes their impact can be negative, and in the case of Bayonetta 3, they're speed bumps in the fast lane. Although I'm a big fan of the Godzilla aspect to these fights, but instead of impressing me, it reminds me of Godzilla Destroy All Monsters Melee on the GameCube. Man, that was a good game. Shout out to those who remember that. I will say there is one encounter that did intrigue me, and it was the first part of the final fight. A huge castle with tentacle appears, and we're like, oh no! So Bayonetta's response was summoning Madama Butterfly, and we get to control her completely. I appreciate this because we increase in size dramatically, but we still retain the core aspects of the gameplay. The controls were still watered down, but it's a start. Which actually, let's talk about that, because we've talked about the comparison between giant bosses and regular boss fights. But some of the best giants are found in games that have such great combat mechanics that they don't really need to change up the formula to have a fair fight. I mentioned 2D games are great when it comes to the camera, and the same can be said for the gameplay. 2D games love to go for one of the most common tropes when fighting giant bosses, fighting the appendages, or a specific section of the body. The hands, the feet, the head, the groin, they all count. The final boss in the main story of Blasphemous has a tomato face that must be squashed and is the only part of the body you can hit. But the boss is so big, you can't reach it normally, so how are we gonna solve this issue? Oh, I wonder. Instead of fighting the boss, you're actually fighting the arena in a sense. And it's great, many games do this, not just 2D games. Platforming is a great tool to retain the original gameplay while still being a fun way to interact with those giant fingernails. You know what, everyone has already talked about Chronos to some extent, so let's talk about God of War Ascension. I have been playing the crap out of this game recently. It's freaking great and completely underrated. I think this may be my second favorite God of War game, right behind Ragnarok. God of War Ascension does not fool around. It is an immediate left hook of pure action from the get-go. Meet the Hecatoncheires. These huge insects are a joy to fight, and there's no special quirks needed. It's just a straight-up brawl. But you want to know something really cool? The Hecatoncheires are only the hands of the whole giant. This is what you're really going up against, and I love how this game builds up to this boss. You're going through a large prison of the damned, fighting the Hecatoncheires as you go. Turns out that prison is also the body of a large giant, who's still alive, by the way. He's being tortured by the Sisters of Fate, which I won't show the fates because of, boobies. But the key takeaway here is that he's the main attraction. God of War knows how to build excitement for a boss, and when that boss is gigantic like a gitch, whatever, it's truly an amazing experience. Instead of the player compensating for the boss's size, the boss here compensates for the player. That's why the mouth mandibles are the weak spots, and it's structured in a way where it's easy to hit, but still difficult. Once he throws you away, another Hecatoncheire shows up, and you're stuck between a Hecatoncheire and a giant face. So what does Kratos do? He freaking uses the giant's own hand parasite to slice and stab the giant's face. What an amazing introduction to this game. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, this is the first boss of the game, not even an hour in, and you've already done all of this. It's incredible. As a matter of fact, now that I think about it, the God of War franchise knows best how to handle giant bosses. The gameplay is pretty complex and flexible enough to manage bosses of ridiculous size, like the Dragon or Garm or Chronos. It simply works in the game's favor to make giant bosses that you can go berserk against because of both the spectacle and the flexible nature of combat. So, if there's anything you should take away from this video, it's that giant bosses are cool, and games with the appropriate gameplay mechanics should make as many giant bosses as possible. They all have an alluring nature to them and can create an experience like no other boss can of smaller scale. And that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. I like making videos like this. It's a struggle though to come up with a script. Challenge runs are so much easier because I know what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. I kind of have a structure to those videos now, but with these, it's always a little bit different. But I always enjoy making them. And I will be doing more challenge runs and videos like this. So if you did enjoy, be sure to leave a like and to subscribe for more content like this. And I'll see you in the next video. Take care, everyone, and of course, stay safe.